On a cold morning in January 1961, deep beneath the streets of Moscow, Soviet military planners gathered around a reinforced concrete table buried more than 30 meters underground. The room was sealed behind steel blast doors designed to survive a nuclear strike. Thick cables ran along the walls. Ventilation systems hummed constantly, filtering air that engineers believed would remain breathable even if the surface above had been reduced to radioactive ash. For the men inside that bunker, this place represented certainty, protection, control. By that point, the Soviet Union had spent more than a decade pouring extraordinary resources into underground warfare. Between 1949 and 1960, Soviet engineers constructed thousands of hardened facilities across the USSR, command bunkers beneath major cities, missile storage tunnels in the Urals, subterranean airfields, and entire logistics hubs hidden below forests and mountains. Some installations were buried 10 meters deep. Others went far deeper. The most critical command centers sat beneath layers of earth and concrete thick enough to absorb the shockwave of a multi-megaton nuclear explosion. The assumption was simple and widely shared within Soviet high command. If war came, America would strike from above: bombers, missiles, nuclear fire. And if everything vital was underground, the Soviet state would survive long enough to retaliate. This belief shaped nearly every major defensive investment the USSR made during the early Cold War. By 1961, Soviet civil defense doctrine estimated that more than 60 even communications lines were buried, shielded from electromagnetic pulses and blast damage. Concrete became the Soviet answer to American power. Above ground, however, the world was changing faster than the generals in that bunker fully understood. Just 6 years earlier, in July 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had approved a program that many American officers initially dismissed as unrealistic. Instead of relying solely on bombers and spies on the ground, the United States would attempt something unprecedented. It would look directly into the Soviet Union from the sky. Not from the edge of airspace, not from borders, from directly overhead. The aircraft developed for that mission, the Lockheed U-2, was designed to fly higher than any interceptor then in service, higher than 70,000 feet, higher than most radar systems were calibrated to track accurately. Early tests showed it could photograph objects on the ground smaller than a truck from altitudes where pilots wore pressure suits more commonly associated with astronauts. The first operational U-2 overflight of Soviet territory occurred in July 1956. At first, Soviet air defense units did not even realize they were being observed. Radar blips appeared briefly, then vanished. Interceptors scrambled but failed to climb high enough. Pilots reported seeing nothing. Ground controllers assumed equipment malfunction. Meanwhile, American analysts began assembling something far more dangerous than a strike plan. They were building a map. Each U-2 flight brought back thousands of photographs. Missile fields under construction, air bases carved out of forests, rail yards feeding underground facilities. Patterns of activity that revealed what was hidden not by seeing inside bunkers, but by watching what moved in and out of them. Still, the Soviet leadership remained confident. The logic seemed sound. Even if the Americans knew where facilities were located, they could not destroy them without nuclear weapons. And nuclear war, Soviet planners believed, would inevitably be mutual destruction. Deterrence depended on survivability, and survivability depended on depth. What they did not yet grasp was that American strategy was shifting away from blind destruction and toward continuous awareness. In 1958, the United States launched its first experimental reconnaissance satellites. Early systems were crude by later standards, but they proved the concept. Objects on the ground could be photographed from space. Coverage could be repeated. Patterns could be tracked over time. By the end of the decade, American intelligence estimates were no longer based on guesses or defectors alone. They were supported by imagery, measurements, and repeated observation. The fear that had once driven massive nuclear stockpiles began to be replaced by something more precise: knowledge. To Soviet generals standing in reinforced rooms beneath Moscow, the bunkers still felt invincible. Thick walls, blast doors, layers of earth, maps that showed safety beneath every major city. What they could not feel was the quiet fact that their secrecy was already eroding. Above them, far beyond the reach of concrete, the United States was learning how to see without striking, how to count without invading, and how to make underground defenses visible with ever setting foot inside them. And the most unsettling realization for the Soviet Union was still to come. They had prepared for bombs. America was preparing to watch. By 1962, the Soviet Union believed it finally understood the battlefield of the future. Nuclear war, if it came, would be short, catastrophic, and decided in the opening hours. The side that protected its command structure, its missile forces, and its industrial core beneath the ground would retain the ability to respond. Survival, not maneuver, was the measure of victory. That belief was reinforced by Soviet experience in the Second World War. Cities destroyed from the air had fallen. Factories dispersed and hidden had survived. The lesson seemed obvious. Depth defeated air power. Between 1950 and 1962, Soviet civil defense spending increased more than five-fold. Entire metro systems were redesigned to double as blast shelters. In Moscow alone, over 200 kilometers of subway tunnels were reinforced with steel blast doors, pressure locks, and independent power systems. Some stations were built deeper than 50 meters, not for transportation efficiency, but for protection. Official planning documents estimated that up to 500,000 people could shelter underground in Moscow during a nuclear exchange. Military facilities went deeper still. Command bunkers such as the Tagansky complex beneath Moscow were designed with walls up to 3 meters thick, shock isolation systems, and filtered ventilation capable of operating for weeks without surface access. Similar structures appeared beneath Leningrad, Kyiv, Sverdlovsk, and dozens of strategic nodes across the Soviet Union. Missile silos were hardened to withstand overpressures exceeding 300 psi, levels thought sufficient to survive all but direct nuclear hits. To Soviet planners, these numbers were reassuring. Concrete could be measured, depth could be calculated, protection could be engineered. What could not be quantified so easily was visibility. In Washington, a different kind of accounting was taking place. By the early 1960s, American intelligence agencies had begun assembling long-term surveillance models rather than single snapshots. The question was no longer simply where Soviet facilities were located, but how they behaved over time. When did personnel arrive? When did convoys move? How often did doors open? Which rail lines fed which underground nodes? Satellites made this possible. In August 1960, the United States successfully recovered film from its first operational Corona reconnaissance satellite. The achievement was modest by later standards, but revolutionary in practice. For the first time, American analysts could systematically photograph vast areas of the Soviet Union without risking pilots or violating airspace in the traditional sense. The early Corona satellites had limitations. Resolution was coarse, coverage was intermittent. But repetition changed everything. Each pass added data. Each image revealed patterns. A forest clearing that appeared empty in one photograph revealed vehicle tracks weeks later. A civilian industrial site showed consistent military logistics traffic. A bunker that could not be seen directly betrayed itself through roads, power lines, ventilation shafts, and heat signatures. The ground did not need to be penetrated. It only needed to be watched. By 1962, American analysts had identified over 1,000 hardened Soviet military installations previously unaccounted for. Missile sites under construction were cataloged by type, spacing, and progress rate. Support infrastructure revealed launch timelines months before missiles became operational. This knowledge quietly reshaped American strategic thinking. If the United States knew where Soviet forces were and knew when they were active, then war no longer had to be a single blind exchange of city-destroying weapons. It could be managed, timed, pressured. The concept of counterforce targeting began to replace earlier doctrines focused on population centers. Instead of destroying cities, American planners increasingly examined how to neutralize missile forces, command centers, and communications before they could be fully employed. This shift did not require immediate attack, it required constant awareness. Inside Soviet bunkers, confidence remained high. Official assessments still assumed that American intelligence relied heavily on guesswork and defectors. The idea that the United States could continuously monitor activities deep within Soviet territory seemed implausible. Satellites, many believed, were unreliable and vulnerable. Space, like airspace before it, could be denied. That assumption would soon be tested. In October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union received its first undeniable demonstration of American surveillance capabilities. U-2 photographs revealed missile deployments in Cuba with extraordinary clarity. Launchers, support vehicles, even fueling operations were visible. For Soviet leadership, this was deeply unsettling. If America could see missiles being installed in Cuba, thousands of kilometers from its borders, what else could it see inside the USSR itself? Still, the lesson was only partially absorbed. The focus remained on physical protection. Harden the bunkers, thicken the walls, increase depth, improve blast resistance. Between 1963 and 1965, additional funds were allocated to expand underground command infrastructure. New facilities were buried deeper, redundant tunnels were added, escape routes were extended. The Soviet Union doubled down on invisibility through mass. But mass did not prevent observation. American satellites did not need to see inside bunkers to understand their role. They counted vehicles, they tracked construction timelines. They compared activity levels. They noted which sites were upgraded first, which received priority maintenance, which had the most redundant power feeds. Every improvement left a trace. By the mid-1960s, American intelligence estimates of Soviet strategic forces were no longer rough approximations. They were statistically grounded assessments, supported by years of accumulated imagery. And with that came a dangerous realization on both sides. For the United States, underground did not mean untouchable. For the Soviet Union, secrecy was no longer guaranteed by depth. What began as confidence in concrete was slowly turning into a strategic vulnerability. The more the USSR invested in fixed underground infrastructure, the more predictable its critical assets became. The ground that once promised safety was becoming a map, and the next phase of this story would reveal how that map changed the balance of fear itself. By the late 1960s, something subtle but unsettling began to surface inside Soviet military planning rooms. It was not panic, it was not admission, it was a growing sense that the rules of concealment had quietly changed. Facilities were still underground, walls were thicker than ever, blast resistance calculations remained impressive on paper, yet outcomes in war games and internal exercises were no longer as reassuring as before. The problem was timing. Soviet planners noticed that American strategic exercises increasingly assumed accurate knowledge of Soviet force posture. Not exact numbers, perhaps, but disturbingly close estimates. Launch readiness windows were predicted with uncomfortable precision. Command survivability assumptions were questioned. Redundancy, once considered an absolute safeguard, was now treated as conditional. Somewhere, the Americans were learning too much. Inside the Soviet General Staff, analysts revisited earlier assumptions about surveillance. The belief had been simple. Underground structures were hidden by default. If something could not be seen directly, it could not be targeted accurately. But satellite intelligence had quietly inverted that logic. By 1968, the United States had launched more than 30 successful Corona missions. Each satellite pass added to a growing archive. Analysts were no longer just identifying facilities, they were building behavioral profiles. This was the shift that Soviet doctrine failed to anticipate. American intelligence did not need perfect images, it needed patterns. A command bunker that received fuel convoys every 14 days revealed its operational tempo. A missile complex that rotated guard units at predictable intervals revealed readiness cycles. Power usage spikes during certain hours revealed training schedules. Snow cleared from access roads revealed priority installations. Even underground doors betrayed themselves. Heavy blast doors left wear marks on rails. Ventilation systems required maintenance. Emergency generators needed testing. Each of these activities left observable signatures, especially when watched over months and years. The ground was opaque. Human behavior was not. By the early 1970s, American intelligence agencies began integrating satellite data with signals intelligence and logistical analysis. Radio traffic correlated with physical movement. Rail shipments aligned with imagery. Construction schedules matched intercepted procurement orders. The result was not omniscience, it was probabilistic dominance. American planners did not claim to know everything, they claimed to know enough. For Soviet leadership, this distinction was terrifying. In 1972, during strategic arms limitation talks, Soviet negotiators raised concerns about American national technical means of verification. The language was diplomatic. The anxiety behind it was not. The USSR was effectively acknowledging that American surveillance systems were reliable enough to monitor treaty compliance without inspectors. That admission carried an unspoken implication. If the Americans could verify limits, they could also verify readiness. And if they could verify readiness, then underground forces were no longer a guaranteed second strike. They were targets with timestamps. This realization did not arrive all at once. It arrived through exercises. During classified war games conducted in the mid-1970s, Soviet planners simulated nuclear exchanges under updated assumptions. American strikes were modeled not against cities, but against launch sites, command nodes, and communications hubs. Even with hardened bunkers, outcomes deteriorated rapidly. Fixed sites survived initial blasts, but coordination collapsed. Communications were disrupted. Leadership continuity fractured. Missiles remained intact, but isolated. Survivability without connectivity proved meaningless. The bunker protected the body, not the nervous system. This was the nightmare scenario Soviet doctrine had never fully confronted. Underground protection assumed survival equaled effectiveness, but modern warfare required integration. Launch authority depended on intact command chains. Retaliation depended on synchronized action. American strategy increasingly aimed not to destroy everything, but to paralyze just enough. Meanwhile, technological asymmetry widened. In the United States, satellite resolution improved steadily. Film recovery gave way to near real-time data processing. Coverage frequency increased. What once took weeks to analyze could now be interpreted in days, sometimes hours. The Soviet Union struggled to match this pace. Its own satellite programs lagged behind. Launch reliability was lower. Data processing infrastructure was slower. While American analysts built cumulative models, Soviet analysts worked with fragmented snapshots. The imbalance was not just technological, it was methodological. American intelligence culture emphasized aggregation. No single image mattered. What mattered was the trend. Soviet doctrine, shaped by decades of secrecy, focused on denial. Hide the object, deny the image, protect the site. But denial failed when observation became continuous. By the late Cold War, Soviet engineers began proposing increasingly extreme countermeasures: deeper bunkers, mobile command centers, buried rail systems, entire facilities mounted on shock absorbers. Some concepts bordered on the fantastical. Yet each solution created new problems. Deeper meant slower access. Mobility meant logistical complexity. Redundancy meant more observable infrastructure. The more effort invested in concealment, the larger the footprint became. The paradox was unavoidable. To function, underground systems had to interact with the surface, and every interaction created data. Quietly, American planners understood something their adversaries were only beginning to grasp. Underground was not protection, it was constraint. It locked forces into known locations. It limited flexibility. It encouraged predictability. The very effort to survive made movement harder. And as long as satellites watched from above, predictability was fatal. By the 1980s, this realization had reshaped American confidence. Deterrence no longer relied solely on mutual destruction. It rested on the belief that the United States could see first, decide faster, and act with precision. For Soviet officers raised on the promise of invulnerable bunkers, this was a psychological defeat. They had built fortresses. The Americans had built eyes. And the next stage of this story would reveal how that imbalance forced the Soviet Union to confront an impossible question. What happens when the safest place on Earth becomes the most predictable one? By the early 1980s, the Soviet leadership could no longer pretend the problem was theoretical. It had become operational. Underground facilities still existed. Missile silos still stood hardened beneath meters of reinforced concrete. Command bunkers still boasted blast ratings measured in hundreds of kilotons. But confidence had eroded. What once felt permanent now felt exposed. The danger was no longer destruction. It was anticipation. American planners were no longer assumed to react. They were assumed to predict. This shift forced a quiet but radical reassessment inside the Kremlin. If fixed positions were increasingly transparent, then survivability could no longer depend on strength alone. It had to depend on uncertainty. And uncertainty required movement. Thus began one of the least discussed transformations of the Cold War, the Soviet turn away from static power and toward mobility. Missiles that once lived in silos were now placed on wheels. The RT-21 Temp-2S, followed by the RT-23 Molodets, represented a doctrinal gamble. These were intercontinental ballistic missiles mounted on road mobile launchers or concealed within ordinary-looking rail cars. From above, they resembled civilian freight. From orbit, they vanished into clutter. At least that was the hope. Each mobile missile convoy could relocate daily. Launch points multiplied across thousands of square kilometers. In theory, this restored uncertainty. In practice, it introduced fragility. Mobile systems required fuel, maintenance, crew rotation, secure communications, and constant movement. Every one of those needs created signatures: tracks in snow, heat from engines, radio traffic bursts, rail schedules that subtly shifted. American analysts adjusted quickly. Instead of watching locations, they watched behavior. They learned which rail yards hosted unusual security patterns, which stretches of forest showed repeated soil compression, which highways experienced unexplained closures, which radio networks lit up at irregular intervals. The shift from static to mobile had not eliminated observation. It had multiplied data. At the same time, American doctrine evolved to exploit this complexity. The United States invested heavily in rapid decision cycles. Intelligence collection was increasingly integrated with strike planning. Satellites, early warning systems, and command networks were fused into a single operational picture. The goal was not certainty, it was tempo. If decisions could be made faster than the enemy could move, mobility became irrelevant. This thinking reshaped American nuclear strategy in subtle ways. Instead of assuming massive retaliation, planners focused on selective counterforce, disabling command nodes, interrupting communication chains, forcing hesitation at critical moments. The most dangerous weapon was no longer the bomb. It was doubt. Inside Soviet command circles, this was deeply destabilizing. Officers trained to believe in redundancy now questioned whether redundancy could be synchronized under pressure. Mobile units might survive, but would they receive valid launch orders? Would authentication arrive intact? Would jamming or deception interfere? Survivability without coordination was no victory. Paranoia crept in. Security protocols grew heavier. Authentication procedures became more complex. Layers of approval multiplied. Every added safeguard slowed response time. Every delay widened the gap between detection and decision. American planners noticed. Simulations suggested that in certain scenarios, Soviet leadership might hesitate long enough for preemptive options to become viable. Not guaranteed, not easy, but conceivable. And in nuclear strategy, conceivable is enough. This tension reshaped arms control negotiations. Treaties were no longer about limiting numbers, they were about limiting visibility. The Soviets pushed for restrictions on reconnaissance. The Americans refused. National technical means became untouchable. Satellites were no longer just tools, they were pillars of stability, at least from the American perspective. But for the Soviet Union, they were a constant reminder of vulnerability. Even worse, internal trust began to fracture. If American intelligence could track movements, then leaks were no longer necessary. But suspicion spread anyway. Who talked too much? Who failed to enforce camouflage protocols? Who authorized predictable patterns? Commanders feared that mistakes would be interpreted as betrayal. This atmosphere fed into broader systemic stress. Economic stagnation limited modernization. Technological gaps widened. Attempts to match American computing and sensor capabilities fell short. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union faced a brutal equation. Fixed systems were predictable. Mobile systems were fragile. Deep bunkers protected leaders but isolated them. Automation increased speed but reduced control. Human decision-making preserved authority but invited delay. Every solution carried a fatal flaw. American strategists, watching from afar, recognized something profound. The Soviet system was no longer confident in its own survival logic. Deterrence depended on belief. That belief was cracking. And cracks in deterrence are dangerous. This was not victory in the traditional sense. No battles were won, no cities captured. Yet strategic balance tilted quietly. The United States had not destroyed Soviet defenses. It had forced them into an endless series of compromises. And as the decade closed, one final realization loomed over Moscow. The underground world they had trusted for decades was not obsolete because it failed. It was obsolete because the enemy no longer needed to touch it. They could simply watch. And that realization would shape the final phase of the Cold War. By the mid-1980s, the Cold War no longer revolved around weapons alone. It revolved around endurance. The Soviet Union still possessed roughly 39,000 nuclear warheads, more than enough to destroy the United States several times over. The United States maintained approximately 23,000 warheads of its own. On paper, the balance of terror remained intact. But paper was no longer where the war was being fought. The true battlefield had shifted into systems, timelines, and confidence. Inside the Kremlin, a troubling pattern had emerged. Every major strategic advantage now required constant investment simply to remain relevant. Underground bunkers demanded upgrades. Mobile missile forces consumed fuel, manpower, and maintenance budgets. Early warning systems required computers the Soviet industrial base struggled to produce reliably. And the economy was no longer capable of absorbing these costs.
By 1985, Soviet military spending consumed an estimated 15 to 17% of national GDP, compared to roughly 6 to 7% in the United States. In absolute terms, the Soviet Union was spending less while devoting far more of its national output to defense. The imbalance was structural. American defense investments spilled outward into civilian technology. Semiconductors, satellite navigation, computing, and material science benefited both military and commercial sectors. In the Soviet system, military technology remained isolated, protected, and inefficient. This gap widened dramatically with the introduction of American initiatives designed less to attack Soviet forces than to exhaust Soviet planning. The most infamous was the Strategic Defense Initiative. Publicly, SDI promised missile defense. Privately, its real impact was psychological. American analysts understood that SDI did not need to work perfectly. It only needed to force the Soviets to assume it might work partially.
That assumption alone was devastating. If even 10–20% of incoming warheads could be intercepted, Soviet deterrence calculations collapsed. Retaliation had always relied on certainty. Partial failure introduced unacceptable risk. To counter SDI, the Soviets would need to expand missile numbers, deploy penetration aids, improve guidance systems, and modernize launch platforms. Each response demanded resources they did not possess. Worse still, SDI exploited the very weakness Soviet planners feared most: technological unpredictability. American research budgets dwarfed their own. In 1986 alone, the United States spent over $3.5 billion annually on SDI-related research. Soviet estimates suggested matching this effort would require diverting funds from civilian infrastructure already in decay. Factories struggled to meet quotas, energy grids faltered, consumer shortages deepened, and yet military planners continued to demand more. This tension reached the highest levels of leadership. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed power in 1985, he inherited a system optimized for confrontation but incapable of renewal. Intelligence briefings painted a bleak picture. American surveillance superiority was expanding. NATO exercises simulated rapid escalation. Command and control vulnerabilities multiplied. Most alarming of all, Soviet early warning systems had already proven fallible. In 1983, a false alarm in the Oko satellite system incorrectly reported incoming American missiles. Only the judgment of a single officer, Stanislav Petrov, prevented escalation. Investigations later revealed software flaws and sensor misinterpretation. The lesson was devastating. The system designed to guarantee retaliation could also trigger annihilation by mistake. Confidence eroded further when analysts reviewed reaction timelines. American decision cycles were tightening. Soviet response times were lengthening under procedural safeguards. The gap between detection and action was narrowing on one side and stretching on the other. Deterrence relied on symmetry. What remained was asymmetry. Gorbachev's response was radical, not because it was idealistic, but because it was pragmatic. If the Soviet Union could not win the race of speed, precision, and perception, it would have to change the race itself. This realization underpinned policies of glasnost and perestroika, not as philosophical experiments, but as strategic necessities. Transparency reduced paranoia. Arms control reduced pressure. Engagement reduced the chance of catastrophic miscalculation. From the American perspective, this shift confirmed what planners had suspected for years. The Soviet system had reached a point where adaptation cost more than concession. Negotiations accelerated. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987 eliminated 2,692 missiles outright. Entire classes of weapons vanished from Europe. For the first time, reductions were verified on site, exposing Soviet facilities to foreign inspection. A decade earlier, such access would have been unthinkable. Now it was accepted. Behind closed doors, Soviet generals admitted what would never appear in public statements. They no longer trusted their ability to manage escalation under modern surveillance conditions. Underground protection was insufficient. Mobility was vulnerable. Automation was risky. Human judgment was slow. The system had become too complex to control with confidence. American observers recognized the significance immediately. This was not surrender, it was strategic exhaustion. The Cold War had not been won by overwhelming force or decisive confrontation. It had been won by forcing the adversary into a position where every option carried unacceptable risk. The Soviet Union still had weapons. What it lacked was certainty. And without certainty, deterrence becomes fear. As the 1980s drew to a close, the subterranean world that once symbolized Soviet strength stood as a monument to a different era. Bunkers still existed, missiles still waited, crews still trained, but the belief that they guaranteed safety was gone. The final phase was approaching, and it would not be decided underground. By the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union still looked dangerous from the outside. Missile silos remained operational, submarine fleets still patrolled the oceans, strategic bombers continued their routes. On paper, nothing fundamental had changed. But beneath the surface, something essential had already collapsed. The Soviet military had been built on a single promise that no matter what the enemy did, retaliation was guaranteed. That promise depended on three pillars: detection, communication, control. By 1989, all three were in doubt. Early warning systems were aging faster than they could be modernized. Command networks relied on infrastructure designed in the 1960s and 1970s. Decision chains had grown longer, not shorter, as safeguards were added to prevent accidental war. Every added layer of protection slowed response time. What once looked like strength now looked like fragility. Underground bunkers, once symbols of absolute security, became symbols of isolation. Generals drilled for scenarios that assumed perfect information in a world that no longer allowed it. Communications exercises revealed delays measured not in seconds, but in minutes. In nuclear strategy, minutes are an eternity. American planners noticed something else. Soviet doctrine had shifted from confidence to caution. Exercises emphasized restraint. Launch simulations increasingly included abort scenarios. The language of inevitability quietly disappeared from internal documents. The fear was no longer American attack. The fear was loss of control. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989 without a single NATO tank crossing a border. No missiles were launched, no bunkers were sealed. The system simply chose not to react. For decades, Soviet citizens had been told that the underground world existed to protect them from American aggression. But when the moment came, protection was not activated. It was irrelevant. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union dissolved without a final confrontation. Roughly 40,000 nuclear weapons were inherited by successor states. Many were decommissioned. Some were dismantled under American-funded programs. The doomsday machines survived the country that built them. And the bunkers? Many were abandoned. Some were flooded. Others were stripped of equipment and left to decay. Concrete walls several meters thick still stand today, silent and empty. They were never breached by bombs. They were rendered obsolete by reality. The Cold War did not end with a decisive strike, a final weapon, or a dramatic underground showdown. It ended when one side realized that its systems no longer produced certainty. And certainty was the real weapon all along. In the end, the most dangerous moment of the Cold War was not when fingers hovered over buttons. It was when one superpower understood that pressing them might not even work as intended. The war beneath the earth had been lost long before anyone admitted it. Not through defeat, but through doubt.